Welcome back. And I'm looking forward to this next panel focused on business model innovation to drive sustainable growth. A warm welcome to our moderator, Navroop Sahdev, who joins us from Hawaii this morning, her time. And she'll be joined by Alan Greenberg, venture partner at EDT Partners, KC, the founder and CEO of Forest Health, and Juliet Davenport, the founder and CEO of Good Energy. Over to you, Navroop.
Thank you so much, Tom. Good morning, very early in Hawaii, and welcome everyone. We have Juliet and Alan joining from London and Chandrasekhar from India, and a very esteemed panel and representing different industries. So welcome to all the panelists. We are very delighted to have you. So, one of the key things when it comes to change, when it comes to the current global crisis, comes straight down to what is the business model innovation that we are looking at. Every crisis forces us to reinvent, rethink the way we do business. And so maybe we can discuss some of that in the context of COVID-19, but even beyond that, right? We're looking at an economic crisis and now a social crisis, particularly in the U.S., where we're looking at industries and populations that are perhaps breaking down because triggered by the health and the economic crisis. So without sort of further ado, Chandrasekhar, I'd love to start with you and discuss a little bit about what you're seeing in the healthcare space with what you're building. What is the type of business model innovation that this triple global crisis is triggering?
Thank you. So primarily, we started with a mission to eradicate avoidable blindness. And the initial focus was to make devices, medical devices, because that was what was lacking. Given that we have accomplished that over the last 9 to 10 years, given COVID is happening, and even prior to that, we were always thinking that the way we can actually go much more deeper in this is if we can not only do preventive care, because end of the day, whether it's developing world or developed world, the number of doctors are always limited. So unless you actually start doing preventive care, it is going to be very difficult, to sustain the cost of overall care, right? So we have been working on this, and COVID has kind of accelerated the whole process. And today, as we stand, we see how much digital we can go with the patient, ensuring that a doctor can teleconsult him, or you can even do disease management of the patient at home. So he should come to the hospital only when it is required. Now, this is not something which is COVID driven, but even otherwise, the patient after a couple of years was not complying to a problem. So if we can actually maintain him digitally at home or nearby, he or she will continue to be connected to the doctor and ensure thereby they don't go into a vision threatening problem or a disease problem which gets much more serious. So I think the business model innovation is going to be much more patient centric, ensuring the behavioral change he or she is going to have, and build tools and technologies around that which will connect doctor, patient, and the service provider, if any, so that continuous care can be maintained. And there will be more and more preventive care, because that will ensure the patient don't get into a situation where he has to be hospitalized or treated.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chandrasekhar. So I think you raised a couple of really important points that we're seeing around. A is the agenda of rapid digitization that's happening and being forced perhaps by COVID, because that's the default way to connect. And the other is, I think, the behavioral change, like you mentioned, that is really at the heart of how things are changing over time. And I think it's very interesting that you mentioned that it's going to be a lot more end user centric rather than business centric. And I'll come back to that in once you hear from the other panelists here. So Alan, I'd love to hear from you, because I think education, the space that you work in that sense is closely connected with what Chandrasekhar just said. given that behavioral triggers and the behavior of the end users is the key. But also at the same time, again, the digital agenda has been a long time coming. So what are your comments on that?
Well, thank you. I mean, first of all, can I say thank you for being here? I mean, it's a great opportunity to share a conversation with people literally around the world. I think that, I mean, you make a very interesting point. I think we've got to start with the fact that we actually live in a very different world today than we lived in 13 weeks ago. And I don't want to in any way belittle the challenges around the health challenges that many families are facing, and obviously the losses that many families have received. But from my point of view, there's never been a more exciting time to drive innovation and drive change. And I think one of the things that's interesting, it came from previous comments, is that stuff that many of us have been talking about for probably months, years, maybe even a decade, is now coming to the top of the interest rate. I mean, does the world need another taxi app, and does the world need another platform for accommodation? Probably not. Does it need innovation around health tech, education, climate change? Absolutely yes. And there's an appetite for this. But also I think there's a step change, a tipping point in terms of people's aptitude and interest to actually come to the table, to innovate, to collaborate, to actually drive something which makes the world we are about to live in a better place than it might have been if COVID didn't happen. So I start from a hugely optimistic point of view, and I think there's opportunities all over the place.
Great, thank you, Alan. I think it's very interesting you mentioned whether we need another taxi app. It applies to so much of wasteful consumption we do, right? Do business executives need to be on a flight every day? I mean, you could do meetings on Zoom, right? Like we are. So something I was discussing with my team at the Digital Economist. So, you raised 2 points. A is innovation that this crisis is forcing for the good, right? There's a pull and the push factors to it. And the other is around forcing us to collaborate and focusing on things that matter. Perhaps let's put it that way. Sectors that should be key in driving the next wave of innovation, right? So healthcare and education, rather than more of the secondary stuff, right, on which our survival doesn't threaten. And I think that is the thing about the crisis itself, that it's forcing us to come back to things that are core.
Can I comment on that, if I may? Because I mean, where I agree, keeping patients out of hospital is actually a very innovative thing to do, and actually helping the health organizations manage their time, manage their efficiency. But there's another piece to this which I think needs serious consideration, is the fact that many of us who are parents, I'm privileged, my children are grown up and out of the nest, but I mean, many families are having to manage homeschooling, for example, as well as combining their time and effort in terms of supporting their jobs and their careers. So it seems to me there's a demand for innovative, intuitive technologies to support that learning journey. And I would also argue that learning and education is not restricted to school leavers and university students, but there is lifelong learning, professional development, career development, and it applies all over the place. So the opportunities are everywhere. The opportunity to realize these goals is a challenge. Right.
Yeah, excellent points. Thank you, Alan. And Juliet, over to you. Very critical industry again, which I'm taking the liberty to call it an industry, but energy is so important. And I think with the crisis, what we're looking at is a reimagining of what we're consuming, why we're consuming, and then putting the agenda of climate change squarely back on track. If we could respond in a way we did to the pandemic with global lockdowns, we could also tackle climate change. So I think I'd love for you to comment on what that's looking like in terms of the business model innovation that we're observing.
Yeah, so I think it is really interesting, and thank you so much for inviting me on this panel. One, it is great to hear about innovations in different sectors, because sometimes we get very stuck in the habits of our own sectors, and actually we can learn so much from other areas and what other people are doing to really bring innovation back into our own businesses. So thank you for today. One of the things for me around COVID that's been really interesting is it's given us a stop point to break habits, and that is break habits both on an individual level but at business level as well. And I think one of the exciting pieces, as Alan alluded to around this, is that we have been given an opportunity to say we don't have to do things the same way we always have. And in particular, when you look at energy and when you look at climate change and defining this new zero carbon future, we've had a chance to really start to look at balance sheets. And the thing is, businesses tend to be developed around creating profitability, giving return to shareholder, and effectively protecting a balance sheet. Now, in this world, what we've seen with COVID is all bets are off on balance sheets. And actually, the opportunity is therefore to say, okay, so if we can find a way of not supporting these balance sheets going forwards and not having governments just bail out all the old companies, can we restart ourselves on a completely different trajectory that basically loosens the binds, because I think although entrepreneurs are brilliant at innovation, I also think everybody's brilliant at innovation. But if you are stuck trying to protect something always, you find that very hard, and taking risk is very hard. So I see that for me as what the opportunity is to kind of get rid of the shackles of our historic balance sheets and really purposefully think about what the future could look like, and where can we take this as an opportunity.
So that's interesting you mentioned that. I agree with that, but I think just as a neutral observer, I wonder, if you look at the responses of the governments, I think we're still talking about similar patterns where trillions of dollars are being pumped into the global economy in order to protect, businesses that exist, and perhaps not the similar bailout like the 2007 and 8 crisis, but now, at least in the US, pumping money straight, which again is short-term cash. So I'd love to hear, and by the way, I don't have expertise in the UK economy. Just 30 seconds on, how that sort of fits into what the opportunity here is.
So from a UK perspective, we've historically had an incredibly powerful aerospace and automobile sector who have been supported significantly by government. And I think this is a real time to stop, because that is where you build in a lack of resilience into a country, where something like COVID can come along and completely wipe out those industries. So if you are going to build back better, and there is a gaining momentum in the UK, and I think across Europe as well, for thinking about how do we re-envisage our economies that not only start to deliver to some of the ambitions about lower air pollution. I think it was touching in the last panel, somebody being able to breathe and not having asthma for one of the first times in a long time, and some of the health aspects, but also building a more resilient economy that can cope with the fact that is COVID a one-off? And I know that probably takes the debate somewhere completely different, but if we want to build in societies that can be more agile, then we shouldn't be betting all our fortunes in terms of how we build our economies in one sector.
Right.
But you see, there's a couple of responses to that. I mean, first of all, Juliet, I agree with most of your comments. I'm not sure I agree with all of them. I mean, when you say that we're all able to innovate, I would argue change management is probably the most difficult thing to deliver across any enterprise, small, big, medium, or big. So that's one piece of the jigsaw. The second point I make to you, I think that, it might not get me a lot of votes, but I think the government's done a remarkable job in holding the UK society together. And if you can imagine, there were no experts in this challenge before it happened, and the ability to improvise and actually drive change, I think they deserve more credit than they're currently getting. And again, there are some heroes within the government that need to be commended for their work and attributes. But there's a no-win situation. Whatever they do, it can't be perfect. I mean, industries like the airline industries are having to change. But the word that you picked on, the one that I think is particularly interesting, and whether you're small, medium, large enterprise, is agility. So the fact of the matter is we do not have to do things the same way we've done them for the last 10, 15, 20 years. We can do them differently. And also, I think from board director point of view, and I chair a number of companies, I think there's never been a better time to advocate change, because you're not going to get the resistance from your shareholders that you might have done pre-COVID. So there's a real time of opportunity here at a corporate level, on an SME level, and there's many startups here who are looking at how they can improvise and be agile and collaborate and take forward their opportunities. So I would advocate you need to be brave, you need to be astute, you need to learn some lessons. And I know we're going to move on to the subject of impact, because I think the impact argument is a critical component, certainly in terms of climate change and many other factors of what the future may look like.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alan. I think you made my job easier. Okay, so since we're on,
that's not my role, but anyway, please continue.
Yeah, since you're on the topic, and I guess before we kind of go into the inspiration for this panel and and the entire series, in fact, which is purpose-driven entrepreneurship and hence impact as one of the key goals, if not the biggest goal. I kind of see this as in parallel to business goals. Just kind of coming back to what we heard so far in the panel, there is a great degree of transformation that's also happening for workplaces, for employees, right, for businesses. And I think one of the key points here is also how people are collaborating, not just that they are, but the how of it, right? So we're looking at a lot more smaller groups, decentralized groups, and a lot of the work we do also at MIT also underlines the fact that these might be better, that might be a better way to organize teams to ensure that people are engaged, because we're looking at different sort of engagement models. So what are you seeing in terms of, again, businesses as they innovate, and then we'll come back to the point on business model, which I think ties in critically with the consumers and what they're demanding, right? What are you seeing in your own sectors? Maybe Chandrasekhar, if you'd like to take up that question on the front of how businesses are collaborating.
Yeah, I think, see, as I started off, it's slowly moving from what it was to a consumer or a patient-centric model, right? So the ability to reach a patient cannot be achieved through one channel or one company, right? So you need to have multiple collaborations, because when you have, let's say, a problem, the solution to that, let's say in our industry, could be a spectacle or a contact lens. So the person who's identifying is an optometrist or an ophthalmologist, but the end product is a spectacle or a contact lens. So, you need to have this collaboration between these organizations who are fundamentally benefiting. And the cost of reaching the customer, which is actually the biggest cost, is fundamentally shared, or, is kind of diversified, in the sense that some of these companies take focus on a particular way, and then that brings in more customers or consumers. And then you have the service providers taking a different route. So when you collaborate, end of the day, your cost of customer acquisition becomes comparatively slower and lower. So that is very critical in today's world, because you don't have too much money to throw around with.
Mm-hmm. Great. Excellent. I think that's an excellent point around, again, how businesses are reaching consumers. So kind of coming back to the point on impact, and I know, Alan, you're keen to talk about it. Let me jump right in here and really ask, what is the role of impact-driven businesses, right? Is that the kind of trend we're looking at moving forward?
Yes, but can I just make a statement or just repeat something? In a previous conference that I attended, Joanna Shields, the chief executive of Benevolent AI, was talking about the technology needs to work for us rather than the other way around. It's a very interesting point, because it comes back to, why do we have technology? What are we using technology? What are we going to be using technology for going forward? It is to do with the benefit of the consumer, of the individual, be that a student, be that a doctor, be that a patient, be that in any different factor. I think we need to look at things differently rather than the way we've looked at them probably for the last 10, 15, 20 years. To come to the specific question you're asking, I do think impact is a very interesting word, and it needs to be understood. Can I refer people to Sir Ronald Cohen, who's recently, well, he's just about to launch a book. The book, surprisingly, is called Impact. And I recommend people to perhaps listen to some of his quotes online and certainly the book. But he talks about having an impact audit, that businesses should be measured not just by their commercial audit, which is something we've got used to. So companies will be measured on their P&L and profitability and other factors, but should they not also be measured on their impact audit? And to try to give you an example of what that means, if you take a company, if you go to Tesla, for example, you would audit them and say, okay, from a climate change point of view, from improving the environment, they rank very high. I mean, the innovation they've made, the product they build is exceptional, and it certainly benefits society. On the other side of impact, if you measure them on how they look after their staff, perhaps their quotient would be slightly different than it would be otherwise. So I think when you start looking at innovation and looking at companies, and you start looking at the impact component of their businesses and how that brings benefit to society and to the workforce and to all other things, it gets interesting. And that is not just restricted to Tesla or Apple or Google or other companies. It is actually applicable to an early stage startup. And Ronald Cohen advocates, and I completely agree, and I think it's certainly a trend which is not new, but is becoming to be more relevant, is that companies will be measured not just on the profit and loss they make and how they increase shareholder value, they will be measured by their contribution to society across all the different subjects, including climate change, including staffing and workforce and everything else. I think this is a key trend and a key component for the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. So it's interesting you mentioned that tech ultimately needs to work for humanity. It took us so long to see the obvious, I think. And yeah, interestingly, at the Digital Economist, that is the core of our mission statement, really, which is to drive technological convergence towards a human-centered digital economy. So it's point on. I wouldn't go into that in this panel, but anyone who wants to discuss that further, please feel free to reach out to the panelists and myself on LinkedIn.
I think Tom is writing notes at this point in time. I'm sure our inbox are going to be flooded with that one.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I think, so one thing is about what we are advocating for as experts in the industries we work for. The other is really what is the macroeconomic policy looking like? What are the priorities of the governments? And of course, we cannot go into all of that right now and really sort of, come to a conclusion. I think there is some divergence. But I think, what really entrepreneurship does is gives us a way to reimagine, reconstruct, and rethink about the future. So I am massively supportive and hopeful that entrepreneurship fills in the gap. And, we've seen that particularly in the developed world, where regulation always trails and dovetails entrepreneurship rather the other way around, with some exceptions of early stage government funds, right, which Tesla, by the way, received a massive push from. So, my question really is to the panelists here and whoever wants to take that and potentially use Juliet, as to what is, again, the role of entrepreneurship in driving sustainability, particularly, as focused on the energy sector, right? What are the sort of traits we are looking at, beyond impact? How does that tie into business as usual? Juliet, you're on mute.
There we go.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. So I think it's an interesting trend now. And actually, I think you could ask the same question of business that you've just asked of the digital economy, is that of digital. Should business serve society in a future world? And actually, what I think we're beginning to see is really that philosophical question come by, because one of the biggest challenges for government is that government finds it very difficult to keep up from a regulatory point of view with what business does and how business innovates. And actually a much better way of helping businesses keep them to their kind of purpose going forwards is to really embed that in the articles of an organization, if you're looking at the UK, or the fundamental startup of a business. And I've been part of something called the Future of Corporation, which is being run in the UK, and nearly 180 CEOs have now signed up to that principle, where they want to look at making sure they embed purpose, which has a wider societal benefit. And that's not just about climate change, it could be about anything, within the articles of their business. And I think this is really, for me, a really interesting future. We as an organization, we have 4 stakeholders we consider. One is a shareholder, one is the people in our business, one is our customers, but one is what we call our future holders, the people who don't exist today in our sphere. So maybe they exist, but we don't interact with them yet. And we think those are as important as those other 3 stakeholders. And running a business is about balancing those stakeholders and making sure you bring value to them all. And I completely agree with Alan in terms of, we now produce something called a purpose report alongside our annual report and accounts, which reports on what we do as an organization on climate change. It reports on all our people and our work around people. And it reports on all our impact on community as well, around some of the projects we work on. And I can see a future where that actually becomes a key value of a brand. And I think that's where we're beginning to see it come through sort of already. But in the future, does that really become part of every single business? You have a purpose, and that's who you are. And your customers and your society know what you do.
Right. I think Go ahead, I was going to say, I think that, I mean, first of all, if you think about it logically, could we have had this conversation 13 weeks ago? We could have had, but it would have been pushed to the back of the room. I think having the conversation today, there's never been a more appropriate time for this to be relevant, because it applies on every level. I mean, if we can stay at home to look after the NHS, surely we can do things to support our climate and support our environment. It seems to me illogical that you only do one, but you can't do the other. Equally, I think that, coming back to my experience over the last few weeks, I've been privileged to share conversations with people I probably couldn't even reach previously. So the ability to collaborate, the ability to have conversations. I would put a caveat there. I'm not convinced how productive I've been. That's a whole different scenario. But given that I'm sitting in my 3rd bedroom and I may be allowed out sometime around about January or February, we'll work that one out. But in all seriousness, I think that it's a special time. All of us hopefully have been reflective. All of us are examining our criteria, our modus operandi. I've been privileged to spend 13 weeks with my wife and daughter. And let me tell you something, it's done our family a hell of a lot of good. So my point is there's some pluses here. But to come back to the debate, I think mentoring is something we need to look at, bringing experience to young people, having greater access to knowledge, trusted networks, authentic content, disseminating research. There's huge opportunities all over the place.
Excellent. Yes, Alan, they say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste because of the extraordinary opening.
100%.
Right. Definitely from an economic point of view. But now I think, given the tragedies, there's that component with the number of people dying around the world, but we do have this opportunity. So I think our audience here is looking to understand, with the opening that we have, what is it that we need to do? How do we reconcile business as usual and what lies ahead? So we have a question from Diana Davidson here, and I'm just going to read that quickly. Although innovation is attractive, it's often challenging to achieve, especially in regulated industries where business as usual is critical. How can we keep the lights on while building the new normal, which we all want to achieve? So I think there's consensus. We want to do things differently, but what does that look like, right? So maybe Chandrasekhar, do you want to take up this question?
Yeah, I think, see, if you look at our industry, the medical devices industry is reasonably well regulated, right? And you have products which are continuously getting FDA or CE kind of clearances to go into the market. But if you see what happened in the last 12, 13 weeks, telemedicine or even getting approval of new devices or new drugs have been fast-tracked. And they have been, people have kind of matched up with the crisis happening so that, this doesn't become the bottleneck. Now, I think there would be, even though it's been done on priority right now, there would be some kind of realistic approach to this, probably 6 months, 1 year from now, where few things will get a new normal. So I think telemedicine is here to stay because people will experience the advantage of actually taking a service from home. And I think there'll be more regulations which will come a little more strict compared to an open kind of a situation. But it'll definitely be much lower than what a device would have ideally had. So I think it's actually going to change. And if you integrate that with data privacy and other things, I think that would become the new normal. And ultimately, the patient or the consumer is the one who should gain in the whole thing. So innovation towards the experience of the consumer getting quality of service is going to become the new normal, and regulation will kind of follow that. It will not be you build regulation and then follow that. I think the experience and the treatment of the consumer will become first, and I think regulation will kind of build around that. I think that is what is going to change.
Excellent points there, Chandrasekhar. So we have 5 more minutes left, you know, we've talked about impact. We've talked about what the future might look like, how we have the opportunity to do things differently. But I think as entrepreneurs, and you know, I am totally in that zone myself, and many of us here, particularly the, I guess, folks who are entering the workspace right now, or are early stage professionals. How do they make money? You know, when we talk about business model innovation, how do they go about figuring out what the new business models look like? You know, the previous channels, they don't exist, right? And maybe they're not available. You can't do an event or things like that, right? So what is the advice from the panelists? And just 1 minute each, let's do a rapid fire. What does that look like?
Can I go first?
Go ahead, Alan.
First of all, some advice I was given many, many years ago is the best time to grow a business is in a recession. If you think about it logically, that does make sense. But also, I don't think there's any substitute for qualitative and quantitative data. I'm working with a couple of young men, 23 years of age, out of Austria, educated in London, who want to drive an education business. And what's really interesting about them is that they could go to market now with an MVP. And they decided, not me, but they've decided to take a step back and really do some qualitative and quantitative data to examine the marketplace, really do the analysis, understand what the change processes are and what innovation really means. And I'm delighted for them. I mean, it could not be better. I mean, that is exactly the right approach. I mean, you asked the question, how do you make money? You know, actors go and work in restaurants. I'm not advocating you should go and work in a restaurant, but you will find a way. And again, there are organizations, there's incubators, accelerators that will support you in this journey. It's not an easy journey. One should not underestimate it. But learn your craft, get some experience, do the qualitative and quantitative piece, and then drive innovation as hard as you possibly can, as fast as you can.
So don't make money right now, just reflect and grow your business.
Look, we all have to survive. It applies to me as much as it applies to everybody else. I'm not advocating anything else like that. But the point is, if you really want to drive innovation, there's a level of sacrifice here. Don't expect society to give you your income or society to provide for you. You have to find a way. And there are ways. And, you know, there are friends and families, there are methodologies, there are processes. Society has never been more open to support people who want to work hard and work smart. I would argue when you look around the world and look at some of the emerging markets, there's an appetite in some of these countries to really work hard and improve their circumstances, which frankly, in our own society, I think can often be lacking. So I know that's not going to make me a lot of friends, but I think that rather than have society owe you something, I think you need to go and work for it.
Mm-hmm. Juliet, what do you think? Thank you, Alan, for your insights.
So if I build on what Alan talked about. So I completely agree with what Alan said, but where I probably would take a cut is in that space. I know that I did that, and that was 20 years ago. But we came into the energy market with the ambition to change the energy market. That was the core reason we existed and have continued to exist for the last 20 years. I think really understanding that really helps you with direction. It also helps you decide what you're not going to do, because one of the key things about setting up a business is sometimes there's too many opportunities. You get too excited about everything. Being really focused on what you want to do and why you want to do it, setting a business up is really hard. So making sure it's something that goes to your heart and that you really believe in, I also think is really important, because I think that drives people and it drives change and it drives innovation. And if you can have that at the beginning, then you can overlay all the data and everything else, and you'll have a brilliant business.
Okay, so purpose at the heart of it. Excellent. And Chandrasekhar, just last thoughts. We are almost at time here.
So I think quickly, philanthropy is not scalable. So you need to build everything into your business model, right? So 20, 30 years back in India, we have a huge revolution in the consumer goods where everything was made into sachets so that the common man can kind of afford. So I think healthcare will also get into smaller pockets. Instead of a capex based industry, it will become a subscription use based industry. So you don't spend too much money, but at the same time, you reach a large section of population on a consistent basis. I think that's what will be the new normal.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists, Alan, Chandrasekhar, and Juliet, for your insights today.